we prepared this paper together with András, and it is his field research. So I would do the presentation and then possibly for any questions about the field, he will answer it. So we are, in this paper, we tried to put together our more general perspective on this peri-urban informal housing issue, at which we have been looking at together a bit for a while. And the way we look at it has this more general background in the literature of global South industrialization, urbanization, and its contradictions, especially this problem that there is this urbanization, industrialization boom in the 20th century, but the housing costs, they remain uncovered. The states in the global South, they don't have enough resources to build housing, and people's incomes are not enough to cover housing from the markets. So there is this relatively generic situation outside of basically the Western cores, that around these new growing cities you have informal outskirts where most of the labor force and the people coming in from the countryside live. And other than this literature, which was relatively constant throughout the second half of the 20th century, now with the present crisis, there is a sort of a rediscovery and usage of this literature also in the US with these new growing truck cities in the urban peripheries. And of course, there is a big focus on the boom of slums in the global South, where this growing unemployment goes. And this, what this literature told us about this sort of informal housing was that it happens because that is where housing can be accessed more cheaply, because the lands have and also the dwellings, they have an illegal, semi-illegal status. There is no infrastructure, so people build it for themselves. They use self-build, and they also use these houses as informal labor sites, also for agricultural food production, but also for other sorts of things like, for instance, doing at home working on informalized sectors of global value chains, like in the putting out system of the textile industry, and so on. So the general conclusion was that what happens in these peri-urban informal housing that is structurally the most significant is that it allows cheaper reproduction costs for the urban labor and labor reserves through pushing down their housing costs and through using lots of informal labor to maintain it. And another conclusion was that from the state's perspective, the most important attitude is the politics of reliance, because they don't have enough resources to change all of it. They need to use that labor force. So it's rather, like shutting the eyes and letting it happen. But there are these short-term dynamics between giving some concessions and expropriating or threatening with expropriation. And it is the dynamics between concessions and expropriation that sort of shape the fate of these informal outskirts, which are on the long term stable. I mean, their volume remains stable or is growing. And in terms of the theoretical aspects of this more broader literature background that we use are these three. So one of them is that we look at this type of informal reproductive labor as part of global capital labor relations. The way this can be summarized most shortly is probably through this statement by Wallerstein that capital globally never pays the full costs of labor reproduction. So there are places, typically in core economies or typically in more high-value sectors, where formal incomes can cover all reproductive costs from the formal market. But for most of global labor, and even more as you go down the economic hierarchy. More and more of the reproductive costs as you go down are covered by this informal reproductive labor, like cooking at home, producing your own food, building your own house, and so on. And we define housing as a major element of this reproductive frontier, also because it is the biggest cost that a household has to pay, but also because of the economic geography aspect. So this problem that labor has to be where the employment is, but as incomes get lower than the price that has to be paid for real estate, then labor is constantly pushed towards cheaper real estate, and there is this kind of friction that is well known to urban geography. And the third aspect is the household, taken as a unit of labor reproduction, which doesn't mean that this is everything we want to know about the household. But in this respect that we are looking at, what is important is that formal incomes get combined with this informal reproductive labor within the household when the household performs the reproduction of labor. And of course, this combination has its own tensions and hierarchies that also comes out in terms of gender and so on. Another term that in this respect was useful to us was this of semi-proletarian household, originally used by Latin Americanists, about how industrialization there didn't lead to full proletarianization in the sense that people would solely consume services from the market, but this was the statement that what they see throughout the history of Latin American industrialization is a continuity of a semi-proletarian household, and this is something that we know from Eastern Europe also well. So, you know, these structures, for instance, of extended households where some of the family still produces food in the countryside, and some of it is working in the industry, and those who work in the city, they send the money. Those who work in the countryside, they sell the food, and all kinds of other semi-proletarian practices like building your own house, for instance. And this is the other relatively theoretical slide, which is about how we look at state socialism and markets in this respect. We don't think of these as two different systems and, you know, society stepping from one to the other in 1989, but rather we think of them in terms of historical continuity of industrialization, urbanization, and so on, and how these regimes are trying to organize them. So we don't think that state socialism is only about state housing and full proletarianization, as opposed to post-socialist systems where you have market-based housing and precarious labor. I mean, of course, if somebody deals with the history of urbanization, it's quite clear state housing was only like 1/3 of housing also during state socialism. So from our perspective, what is important in this historical continuity is the state socialist internalization of world economic imperatives, and namely, especially the one of forced industrialization, that you have to raise the technological level of the local economy in order to be in a better position when within the world trade. And this priority is causing similar urban-rural hierarchies as elsewhere in these import substitution industrialization efforts globally. So, you know, the downgrading and expropriation of rural resources to push urbanization and industrialization, and then these tensions that come out in terms of housing and labor dynamics, also quite similar to elsewhere, which in the case of state socialism was called the problem of socialist under-urbanization, but it is very similar to the structural situation that develops elsewhere in the global south, meaning that there is industrialization and the use of labor in industry goes faster than the building out of housing for that kind of labor. And because of this, we see commute where the reproduction of labor is cheaper in the countryside, but its use happens in the city, or weekly commute where you only have worker homes or bed rentals, or you have this peri-urban informal self-build that we are going to speak about. And so our statement is sort of that this is similar to what this broader global literature describes, and it looks rather continuous before and after socialism. If we look at the function of peri-urban informal dwelling in the relation between housing and labor. And there is another topic here which we don't have time to open, but just wanted to flag, which is about how this is more broad. So the use of this informal reproductive labor within the socialist second economy, how much it is similar to what becomes discovered throughout the 70s in other global semi-peripheries too, and they are called informal economies or popular economies or economia sommersa, and how they become addressed and integrated into policies like sites and services or microcredit. So we don't have time to speak about this, but just wanted to put it there as a background. So in the case of Budapest, it is quite strong, this aspect, also because Budapest is a very centralized urban hub within Hungary. This was true also in the size of historical Hungary. So there are these numbers for capital concentration already in 1910. And on this level of capital concentration, socialist industrialization was built because it was built on previous industrial infrastructure. After 89, the reindustrialization that happened through Western FDI, it happened through greenfield investments. So that didn't go to Budapest, but the Budapest still dominates in service and finance, which is still among the highest added value sectors. So this is just a map in terms of Human Development Index, and you can see how Budapest and its surroundings really stand out like a peak on Austrian and even West German levels. And this is the same if you look at demography. So it becomes very strong, this type of concentration, in the first big urbanization boom in the late 19th century, beginning of 20th century. And it becomes even more emphatic because of Hungary's loss of territories in 1920. And then the socialist regime has to do something with this, and they do what many other regimes do at the same time, like they try to limit rural immigration, but still there are these waves of households who are fleeing collectivization and are seeking industrial jobs. So many of them move to the agglomeration, and you have this tension that state housing is not in par with labor concentration. And after 89, Budapest remains very attractive, but the picture becomes a bit more complex because there is a wave of middle-class suburbanization, and there is also a peripherization of lower middle class and poorer households. So Budapest per se population shrinks, but the agglomeration grows. So the Budapest and its surroundings still remains the biggest hub. And then within this, András did this background research in the historical longer-term role of peri-urban spaces, and he found that it is quite continuous, their role, how they mediate urban-rural demographic flows as of these intermediate spaces. And these elements seem to be true to them on the long term, that they offer cheaper is moving closer to Budapest labor market. They are cheaper because they are informal, the use of land, typically on former gardens and agricultural lands that are informally distributed and then maybe legalized later. The infrastructure is built by households. The houses themselves are self-built, although with using this mutual help, which the special word for it in Hungarian is kaláka. The houses are built using second-hand materials, which is another classic element that all of this literature mentions. And they also use the plots to produce food and do other kinds of informal economic activities. So our first case study to show this is that of Lakihegy during state socialism from the late 60s on. And this was built on an agricultural land next to the Chapel Works, which used to be the biggest machine factory at the time. It's outside of Budapest's administrative border, and it's an illegal site that has been built by first-generation industrial workers, so the latest waves who come in. It used to be a manor, then after 45 an agricultural cooperative, and in 67 there is this partial liberalization of land where some parts of land are allowed to be sold for gardening plots. And it is after this that it's about 400 illegal dwellings are established here. And as I already said, the picture is confirming to that. So these are self-built houses. There is collectively self-built water and electricity infrastructure. They even do kaláka for building a bus stop, medical station, and pavement. And they use kaláka in the construction of individual houses. And sociologists in the era, they describe this. And for instance, one of the things mentioned when speaking about kaláka in the construction of informal self-built houses in the agglomeration, they note how it overburdens households because they use all their incomes from their workplace, plus they use extra work as resources to be able to build the houses. But when you use kaláka for your own home, it means that you're obliged to go and work on other people's houses later. And this is just too much work for the household to bear. And at that time, some of these commentators said that this proves that this self-help model is bad for the households, that it generates losses, and the market option would be better. But if we look at this more global picture, then it looks like the market option doesn't produce an alternative either. It is this generic pressure that are on this type of household in the present structure, and why the burden is unbearable is because the amount of work that the household is supposed to do to compensate labor reproduction costs is too much. Another way how the literature, the era treated this was mentioning that this dichotomy that they are fully legal workers under socialism, but they are illegal dwellers. And this is associated with the lower interest representation capacity, both at the workplace and at the place of dwelling. Because at the workplace, these are the workers, typically unskilled, the latest waves coming in from rural areas, and they start working in unskilled, the worst and worst paid positions, which they don't like, and this is the segment of workers that fluctuates the most. So they are quite likely to change workplaces if there is something instead of, So the exit option is stronger than building interest representation. They are not real members of the unions, for instance. And meanwhile, at the place of dwelling, they count as illegal dwellers. So their interest representation is not going to happen through the local council either. And yes, sociologists at the era tried to propose these new institutional solutions to somehow create interest representation for these kind of dwellers too. And our second case study is a more recent one, so the fate of peri-urban allotment gardens since '89. These allotment gardens, they were distributed in the 70s and the 80s as for blue-collar workers as agricultural and recreation plots. So it's a bit part of the second economy system that you allow people to work more in their free time for themselves. And they had farm buildings on them, like cellars, and they could even have small weekend houses on them. And after 89, as it was mentioned yesterday in the Czech case too, there is an appreciation of the plots because they could be, so there was privatization of land, they could be sold. And there was a demand for them to be sold for informal dwelling developments, which were multiplying quite rapidly. So by 2011, you have around 90,000 nationally. And in another article with András, we were looking at how in the present constitution of allotments, you can see the waves of housing peripheralization from Budapest. So you can see in the 90s, the effect of the utility price boom after the privatization of utilities. And at the same time, unemployment that came from the industrialization. So many people were unable to pay, became unable to pay for housing costs within the city. There is the effect of the 2008 and afterwards debt crisis. People who suffered from it, and also people who were trying to avoid that as a result. And then there is the effect of the surging real estate and rent prices after 2015, when we have this huge real estate bubble also promoted by the state. So you see these waves of housing peripherization and how households trying to keep close to the Budapest labor market are trying to go against these waves by establishing these semi-legal dwellings. What was also interesting is that the labor market that they are looking at is mostly services, because that's what you see in Budapest, but also particularly, which this literature also mentioned, they are foundational public services, like, for instance, public transport workers, so which is a typical stable job that you can have in Budapest, but it is underpaid to be able to pay Budapest housing prices. So what these houses now, people are living there permanently, but it's not an official dwelling area. Infrastructures are lacking, so you would have electricity, but you wouldn't have water and canalization, which provides cheaper land and utility costs. People use informal self-build and renovation, and create these houses out of what used to be fruit storages or cellars, and officially still count as that. They are listed as that. And they also do informal development of common infrastructure, and they also lobby for the introduction of utilities, but only partially. And I will get back to that. And there is a varying acknowledgement by the local state. In some of these localities, these informal dwellings are already in a higher number than their official population. So I just brought this line from one public official who says that we hope they don't activate themselves. So it's relatively okay, but we hope it won't go further. But it's varying also because of the type of political constitution of the local government. And if you are more interested in that, András can tell you more about it. So this other thing that I was mentioning, that there is the lobbying for services, but there is also very strong ideologies of freedom and self-sufficiency, which structurally boils down to this problem that if there is a full formalization and infrastructure is brought in, then they might not be able to use the benefit of cheaper land and utility costs. And here I just brought this line of one of the dwellers, how how in the expression this comes in the languages of freedom and nature and self-sufficiency. So he says, if we had official water infrastructure here, we would lose the essence of living here, the silence, the calmness, and the private sphere that is not 100 but 1,000 square meters. So this is one picture. It's a typical situation that it's second-hand material and self-built and semi-legal, but on the other hand, the people really try to make it as a real suburban house. So just to conclude, in terms of this big macro-structural picture, what we think is happening here is that labor and surplus labor's reproduction is made cheaper through informal housing, through the economic geography, that it happens still close enough to the urban workplaces, but in cheaper land, because of using the extra informal labor of the household and of others, and because of taking higher risks. There is still the potential risk of expropriation because they are not official permanent dwelling places. But compared to this structural situation, the household's perspective is totally active. So they speak about how actively they are solving the dwelling and the infrastructure problems. How this allows them to avoid debt and, you know, the mitigation of agency that debt means. And there are also these complex moral economies of alternative solutions that are produced. So it is obviously not just money that is used as a currency, but mutual help with and all kinds of moral and symbolic translations of somebody's long-term investments in terms of the moral economy. So in how this comes out in terms of values is that it is ingenuity, independence, and control that is very much valued by these dwellers. And if you remember Juraj Buzalka's idea about the post-peasant ideal of the house and homesteading in post-socialist countries, or in his case, Slovakia, this is very similar to it. So Buzalka argues that what recent right-wing populists address so successfully in these countries is this post-peasant ideal of the house, meaning as this main focus of social value and reproductive efforts. And identification, so you wouldn't identify yourself professionally or as a worker or even nationally or according to party politics, but first of all as a member and maintainer of the household. And he says that this goes back to the sweet memories, post-socialist sweet memories of how it was possible under socialist second economy to use the household's movement within the formal economy and across the second economy to maximize this reproductive capacity of the house or the household. And we agree with this, but our idea is that this is not only a specificity of how post-socialist nostalgia of second economy household reproduction works, but this is a situation quite characteristic to how structural conditions to cheapen reproduction costs are continuous across global regions and across pre-socialist, socialist, and post-socialist regimes. Now, of course, just stating that this is continuous is important for us, but then it requires going closer and looking at the details of how it changes, which we are not going to do now. And this statement is the same in the case of state toleration. So toleration and use by the state of these informal housing solutions is continuous. But of course, when we zoom into the local state, then it's varied according to the dynamics of concessions and expropriations or threats of expropriation. And from the perspective of the households, we also think that this silent pact for cheaper reproduction is continuous, but on the other hand, from the household's perspective, this is also a continuity of active negotiation, trying to, by your own ingenuity and extra efforts, trying to turn resources more towards household and reproductive means and to lose them less to external costs. During the second economy, this was relatively successful. So there was this reproductive accumulation by households, relatively successful. In Hungary, it is the biggest wave of rural house building that you have then, and still rural settlements are defined by the landscape of that type of Kádár cube houses that were built at the time with these kind of means. Also, elsewhere, this is mentioned, like the anthropologist Creed, he speaks about the domestication of industry in Bulgaria, by which he means that in a situation of very strong labor shortage and parallel industrialization efforts, households' bargaining power to turn resources towards this kind of households' reproductive accumulation becomes quite successful, to the level when they can even bend central industrialization plans towards what is more useful for them. Of course, this balance of powers changes after '89 in Bulgaria too. And in the cases of our allotments, one of the main gains that households voice is being debt-free and not having to pay rent today.